I'm really delighted to welcome you to this special event with Ali Zaidi. I first met Ali when I was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama White House, and Ali was Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Council for Energy Policy, where we worked. Among other things, we worked on the Clean Power Plan. Ali combines deep knowledge with strategic insight, and you could tell he was an up-and-comer even when in the Obama administration. He has the rare ability of being able to make things happen in the extremely complicated environment of the White House and Washington. Ali joined the Biden administration initially as Deputy National Climate Advisor. In September 22, he took over as National Climate Advisor and head of the White House Climate Policy Office, the most senior climate position in the White House. Over the past 4 years, Ali's been at the heart of the administration's efforts on climate and energy policy. Among other things, he helped to design, negotiate, and implement the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Together, these climate efforts have spurred investment in low-carbon energy technologies and have significantly reduced projected CO2 emissions. For example, in an article in the Journal of Science last year, multi-model estimates project that the IRA will reduce U.S. CO2 emissions in 2030 by about 9 percentage points, from a 28% reduction relative to 2005 to a 37% reduction. Subsequently, the administration has finalized tailpipe CO2 and fuel economy rules for automobiles and the power plant rule, which regulates CO2 emissions from new gas and coal-fired power plants and existing coal-fired power plants. A month ago, the White House set an ambitious 2035 emissions target in the context of the Paris Climate Accord of 61 to 66% below 2005 levels. But these are a few of the many climate and energy efforts over the past 4 years which Ali has been at the heart of. So we're delighted to have Ali Zaidi here today to discuss the work of the administration and to look ahead. Please welcome Ali to the podium.
A few last days with government technology, which I will miss so much, and not this. Thank you, Professor Dr. Jim Stock. Jim doesn't know this, but the first time I met Jim, like maybe some of you, was through a book called Econometrics. But I found him to be far more multidimensional when he was down the hallway as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. And really, you know, Jim is brilliant, he is kind, he is generous, and he is humble. So much of what we accomplished over the last 4 years is the work of many of you, participants in a conversation that has entailed passing the baton one to the next, laying the intellectual foundations, building the political momentum to get big things done. We do all of this work only if we are in team and together. As we gather today, the fury of climate change rages the fires in the foothill communities of Southern California. It's a heavy moment that reminds us that there are no climate havens anymore. Communities that are far from the coasts are being flooded by hurricanes. Communities far to the north are seeing the impacts of extreme heat. And communities that are in the wealthiest nations are starting to realize that development status provides no escape for a crisis that impacts all of us and calls on all of us to take action. Over the last 4 years, one of the things we've tried to do as the Biden-Harris administration is to map the impacts, literally and figuratively, with new satellites in the sky, better data, and new tools, a new portal to get the information into the hands of decision makers. We've also mapped the impacts onto our macro economy and to our fiscal health, onto our infrastructure and our institutions, on things like the insurance markets, work that was catalyzed in the first few months of the administration by a pair of executive orders that named climate resilience and climate risk, the impact on our financial system, as parts of the agenda. This was not going to be an administration that focused purely on emissions. It was going to take a broader view, and mitigation needed to be on the same page as adaptation in the executive order that was issued on day one. We got to work bending the curve on those risks themselves. New grants to raise roads, to harden substations, to deploy permeable pavement, to restore critical wetlands, expanding our ability, in this case, to absorb the next downpour. We brought together labor and industry and the health sector to better engage the risk from extreme heat. We set new standards to protect workers, not uncontroversial, surprisingly not uncontroversial, new canopy in communities that had been redlined as part of a racist housing policy from decades ago that are literally hotter today, and new missions for old institutions. Our U.S. aid agency brought together the development finance institutions from around the world and charged them to finance the solutions to combat extreme heat, the biggest killer from climate around the world. We broke the fever on an epic drought out west, securing more than 3 million acre-feet of water in a river that feeds 40 million Americans. And we started the hard work of long-term infrastructure build-out, from desal to catchment to canals. One that I just love, and I saw Governor Stephen Rowe Lewis in the West Wing lobby just hanging out a few weeks ago, is this canal covered with solar built in partnership with the Gila River Indian Nation that is not only providing water security but energy security to the tribe. And we did something important in elevating the conversation around resilience and adaptation. We shined the spotlight for our innovators on these tasks. We launched a set of game changers, convened the best and brightest to hasten new solutions to solve the crisis that is at our doorstep. Fire tech, water tech, and more. Earlier this month, we transmitted to the United Nations our national framework on climate resilience and our national adaptation plan under the Paris Agreement. But the most important part of the approach to taking on these impacts, they're hard to write down in a submission to the United Nations. I saw it last month as I traveled to swear in new members of the American Climate Corps. And I was in the room and afterwards meeting with some of the folks. And this young woman, Andy from Boone, North Carolina, her community had been knocked down by Hurricane Milton. It had taken away so much. And the choice Andy decided to make was to give back. Today, I'm happy to report that 20,000 young people have signed up and joined the American Climate Corps since Earth Day of last year, in less than a year. And from their model, we learn, I think, perhaps the most powerful lesson. In the face of all of this doom and gloom, the generation that has the most right to despair and disengage has chosen to plug in, to believe in the hope and possibilities. And that is a lesson to all of us. As we enter the second half of the decisive decade for climate action, I believe that we will win on our global targets for a safer and more prosperous future because we carry with us this fundamentally rewritten playbook, the one that Andy is a champion for, one that eschews the doom and gloom and embraces the hope and possibilities. I saw that last night. I was standing by the president as he signed into law 2 new monuments. And looking out over the crowd, a group from California, where the 2 of us had been just a week ago trying to hold that very event. Despite all of the crisis and calamity, looking back with a sense of empowerment, a sense that they could meet the moment. That occasion celebrated for us over 670 million acres of lands and waters protected, the most by any president, an ode to what he calls America the Beautiful, but also to a new approach to climate action, one that enlists nature as part of the solution to the crisis we face down, not just to help us adapt, but also to help us attack the root cause. And now I go to the root cause. Last month, as Jim mentioned, we announced our new nationally determined contribution, our new climate target for America under the Paris Agreement that gets to the root cause of the climate crisis, reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are warming the planet. And our target, as announced, is to reduce the emissions by 61 to 66% by 2035 relative to 2005 levels. And perhaps before I dive into the sector by sector approach that we followed to get to this target, the bottom-up analytical approach, let me speak directly to the audacity of articulating a target to continue to reduce our emissions as a new Congress and a new administration comes in that has explicitly said they will deprioritize action on climate and in many cases seek to deliver a U-turn. When we did that exercise, bottom to top, what we found is that the technology, the economics, and the course that has been set, not just by the federal government, but by state and local governments, can help us achieve this target. Now, this is an intellectually rigorous group, so let me admit, the top end of that range is unachievable without a federal government that is aligned. But we have a decade to get there. And we have a track record of bipartisan action, of Republican and Democratic administrations moving forward the cause, whether they label it climate action or they label it the work of economic security or geopolitical risk management. So 61 to 66%, the target not only holds up from a bottom-up perspective, but aligns with essentially a linear trajectory to net zero by 2050, which is, as the scientists have deemed it, essential if we are to stabilize the climate situation around the world. This follows what we did at the beginning of the Biden administration in terms of process, looking across the landscape, going bottom up, and articulating a target for, at the time, 2030, when the United States was on track to reduce our emissions roughly by 15 to 20% by 2030. Against that backdrop, which was entirely off track relative to any reasonable and rigorous scientific progress towards where we need to go, we set a target of 52 to 52%. So baseline 15 to 20, target 50 to 52. So if you think we were being audacious in December when we said not only will we continue the course, but we will be able to expand on it. Think about if you pulled out that time capsule that you buried with your reaction to the Biden-Harris NDC at the beginning of the administration. Today we stand having more than doubled our pace of decarbonization, and the target is suddenly within reach. The math goes something like this. In 2005, overall US emissions were north of 6,500 million metric tons. By marshaling a bold strategy that drew on an investment approach and the toolkit of setting standards, we've unlocked a pathway now that projects us to either a little over or a little under 4,000 million metric tons by 2030. And from the high 2000s to the mid 3000s in million metric tons by 2035. The math reflects the impact of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, enhanced by a complementary architecture of federal standards that spur demand and generate the regulatory certainty needed to accelerate capital formation and encourage entrepreneurial risk-taking. It's an important combination, so I will restate it. The success comes from pairing catalytic public investments and tax credits and standards that set a signal to the market that spurs long-term investment and firms up that next bet on America. So now we seek to take that success and aim it at breaking into the low 2000s in million metric tons by 2035. And we find a lot of things to be true that were true when we were aiming at 2030. The first is that there is both a lot of uncertainty and a lot that rides on the transformation in the power sector. Especially in this part of the journey, that is the big swing that will determine whether we are on the higher end of achieving or whether we miss the mark. The second is, while we have a tremendous amount of momentum in transportation, for us to break through to the other side, we have to take what we've accomplished in the light-duty vehicle sector and mobilize that in other sectors. We're in very early innings in heavy transportation. The work of moving freight by all modes continues to lag relative to where we need to be. Our ability to get that on wheels, so to speak, will unlock our ability to get to where we need to go in 2035. But ultimately, there's no single sector that does all the work. No single policy that will do it. For us to succeed, every sector, every level of government, every layer of the capital stack, every party, and every part of the country will have to step up and go big. So, quickly, because I'm eager for the conversation, let me walk through some of the sectoral proof points that give us a sense that we can go the distance. Let me start with nature and that event celebrating Chuckwalla last night. In addition to the monuments that I described, a big focal point for this administration has been the trees that breathe in the carbon that we put into the sky. I sat with the indigenous communities in the Tongass at the beginning of the administration as we worked to help them unlock the value in the California carbon markets to go from an approach that sustained their way of life but relied on making sure that they had access to harvest timber to one that frees them from that and enables them to capture the value for the stewardship that they had been doing for generations. And we saw that approach take off globally. I joined the president as we soared above the Amazon, the first US president to show up. And what was more exciting in some ways was when we got back on the ground and met the entrepreneurs, the folks from satellite companies who are making sure MMRV is strong, the indigenous communities that are on the front lines of stopping illegal deforestation using tools from those very satellite companies and AI helping them to get to the frontier of where the illegal harvesting is going on, and the entrepreneurs who have decided this now feels like a market they can bet on. Those are the sorts of tools we need to scale up in a massive way. And we're not there yet, but we know how to put the deals together, and we need to get from deal by deal to platforms that enable massive investment in this arena. Climate smart agriculture is another place where in the Obama years, we were putting the seeds in the ground. In the Trump years, they passed a farm bill that actually invested in standing up these programs at pilot scale. And Joe Biden was able to come along with a big pot of water and help the beanstalk grow to a point where we now have, get this, 180,000 farmers and ranchers across the country enlisted in climate-smart agriculture practices on over 200 million acres of land in the United States. But that's still less than a quarter of the way there. So when we think about what's possible in the nature sector, we think about the next farm bill that is now overdue and needs to be passed and could be the way for us to boost total factor productivity. It could be the way for us to help lift up the incomes of especially family farmers who are living at the knife's edge, and in the process, breathe in all of the excess that we've put into the atmosphere. We're doing this in the power sector. If you would have told me when we were sitting around, it was COVID, so we had maybe 10 executives and them spread out across the entire state dining room with the beak-looking masks. You remember those? Super goofy. And we're talking about, we still called it Build Back Better and the tax credits and what the utility sector would need. And if we could come together on the work of starting to build out the transmission capability to get to the scale we needed to. I wouldn't have bet that in 2024 we would put more electricity on the grid than we have in 2 decades, and 96% of that was going to be clean. We constantly, in the climate story, underestimate the impacts of climate change, but we also underestimate our ability to scale up the solutions at speed and scale, and the power sector is a powerful example of that. You see it in nuclear. I visited this nuclear facility in Western Michigan where a co-op called the Wolverines and a co-op called the Hoosiers have come together. It's kind of cool. If they can do it, Democrats and Republicans can. They have come together to bring a nuclear plant out of retirement. And if you want to think about the indirect impacts of this work, think about the guy who is coming back to work. He thought he had retired just like the plant had, and is coming back to train the next generation of utility workers. That's exciting stuff. And I'm one of those folks who's been a skeptic that the nuclear renaissance is right around the corner, but you have that taking place there. And in Pennsylvania, you have folks in North Carolina and in Arizona trying out new reactor technologies. Wyoming, at the site of a former coal plant, building the next generation of reactor, and in the process, lifting up communities that have been left out and left behind. And you want to talk about bipartisan? In the heat of the summer, remember the summer? There's a lot going on in the elections. I was standing there in the Oval Office and literally hand in hand, not a joke, Tom Carper, the Democratic chair of the Environment Committee, and Senator Capito from West Virginia, the Republican now chair of the Environment Committee, walked in hand as the President of the United States signed a bipartisan bill to advance progress on nuclear. It can be done. If it can be done in an election year, at the peak of it, it can be done the next 4 years. And on transmission, let me take a little sidebar, because yesterday the President signed an executive order on artificial intelligence, and in particular on making sure we supply clean power to scale up this absolutely critical industry. There's a lot that's been written about this being the headwind that will knock us off course. It's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. The data centers that are driving some of the demand growth in the United States are also the ones that have been driving the reforms on the system. They've been pulling on the system to bring new clean energy onto the grid. We need to root for the success of that transformation. And there are 3 things that I think we can actually bootstrap to this transformation if we are creative. Jim talked about the art of getting something done. And the way you do that is by hitching yourself to a shooting star. Here we have an opportunity to advance what I call the 3 R's, the work of rewiring, repowering, and building more resilience onto the grid. Rewiring means investing more in advanced conductoring to get more electrons across existing rights of way, dynamic line ratings to raise the grid's speed limit. I mean, the fact that you have an entire grid that largely is stuck on the same speed limit regardless of its capacity and regardless of the demand and supply is kind of silly. So if we're looking for efficiency and a way to grow the economy without having to do a lot of work for it, that's a pretty smart way to go. And batteries, storage as transmission assets, helping us deal with the rush hour traffic on the grid. Another easy way to get more electrons flowing. Repowering. Now, we've talked about the old coal plant that went away, and then we used the substation to help get clean energy back on the grid. I saw that most vividly in a partnership between the Navajo Nation, the electrical workers, developers, and utilities in the Four Corners in New Mexico, where once there was a coal plant, now there is a massive solar farm using that same interconnection capability. But there's another piece of this, which is to build renewables around underutilized substations, as current plants don't need to retire. They can stay plugged in, they can stay around for the resilience benefit they provide, they can be supplemented, and we can use the interconnection more effectively. And finally, one of the things I've spent a lot of time learning about is what are the resilience attributes different demand requires on the grid. And all AI is not the same. All data centers are not the same. We can provide, using upgrades to resilience, the type, the quality of electricity by also just investing in resilience to the grid. We're doing this, folks, we're doing it in transportation as well. I love talking about batteries, so I cannot resist, and I will talk about the batteries, but there's so much else that's going on. In batteries, of course, we are way ahead of, I think, where you would have guessed we'd be 4 years ago, and maybe I shouldn't put you in the same boat as me. I will tell you, we're driving to Dearborn from the airfield, and the president says, how quickly can we get this technology that was invented in the United States, that provided Nobel Prize to US scientists, that was perfected in our national labs, how quickly can we start to make that technology here in the United States? I said, best case, sir, 15 years it'll take to get to the scale we want to get to. Well, here's the amazing news. We are now factories up and running or under construction on a trajectory to manufacture 10 million EVs worth of batteries by 2030. We sell 15, 16 million cars a year. So that is dramatic, but that's not even the most exciting part of the story. Double click and you see the anodes and the cathodes and the membranes being manufactured in the United States. Double click and you see the active material on the cathodes being manufactured by mine workers in West Virginia who are showing up to turn on what used to be a glass factory and manufacturing. Double click and you see the lithium and the graphite starting to show up here in the United States. That happened in 4 years. Think about what we can do in the decade ahead. But if we are to succeed at getting to that high end in 2035, just staging the climate comeback to bring the capacity back is not enough. We're going to have to tighten the loop between our innovation and our factory floor. And the United States will have to create the market certainty so that the next generation of battery technologies We're behind on things like LFP. But there's another generation behind that. How can we do all that it takes to secure that opportunity here, and in the process, hasten the delivery of it to the global marketplace? Sustainable aviation fuels, gotta do the plug on this, because this is another place that I have to shout out my former colleague here, Jane Flagel, who was there in the dark COVID Zoom pre-passage of anything part of this journey with us in the Biden-Harris White House. And I think of her, unfortunate for her, every time I think of hard to decarbonize sectors of the economy, because she was our senior director for industry. But in those early days, we got together every airline CEO, and we said, what can we get done on sustainable aviation fuels? At the time, we were making single-digit millions of gallons of SAF in the United States, single-digit millions. And so they said 100 million gallons by 2030. 100 million, which at the time sounded crazy because it was probably like 50 times more than we had made. We talked to our experts and our analysts, and then we just did the thing you kind of have to do when you're way behind on the climate crisis, and we just sort of bet on our ability to do more. We set a target for 3 billion gallons of SAF production capability in the United States. This past week, the news hovered around the announcement of the 45Z tax credit, which provides incentive to folks who are making the SAF. What it missed was an analysis by the Department of Energy that went bottom up, looking at all the factory capacity that's being built out in the United States, and found that we are going to exceed 3 billion gallons by 2030. It has taken off, and it's taken off because we made a bet on our ability to deliver. And that brings me to two sectors that, for very different reasons, are incredibly hard to decarbonize. And they tell us different things about what we must do to go the distance. The first is the building sector. We've made tremendous progress in the building sector. Over the last several years, we have seen the lines cross between new build that is electric and new build that is fossil. More heat pumps going in, whether at the residential level or at the commercial. We've seen efficiency continue to be accelerated, in particular as we start to see these buildings as things that are part of an internet that can help us optimize the way we use energy. But we are still so far behind in turning over the stock more quickly. And that is a challenge not just for the scientists and engineers, and we need them to focus on this part of the problem, the balance of systems, the hard work of actually putting the heat pump in the house, which takes too much time, is too technically complex relative to what it should be. Think about click once to buy, right? You click on Amazon and it shows up at your doorstep a day later, maybe in the morning. Heat pumps, you click, and 9 months later, someone's showing up for a multi-week exercise that inconveniences you. That's a lot of friction to work through. So there's finance work, and we're standing up. We have capitalized a new national network of green banks, $27 billion through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Finance is a big part of it. Marketing is a big part of it. But so is the engineering at the retail level, which has not gotten the attention that it deserves. And then heavy industry, my dear, dear sector of the economy, where I often describe, people have asked me, how do you feel about our trajectory, again, relative to a transition that's taking place in Washington? I say, over the last 4 years, we've been very intentional about structuring our policy as booster packs on a rocket. And in so many cases, the rocket has achieved escape velocity. in power, in transportation, in some ways even in agriculture. In heavy industry, we have built the launch pad, and that is a massive accomplishment, in large part shepherded by my dear friend who's here. But we've got a long ways to go. We have an international trade system that is still catching up to the practice of seeing the molecules of carbon as they cross borders, let alone leveling up to do something about it. We've got a demand side that is largely pulled forward by government actors who have a big role to play, federal and a dozen and so states in the United States, and then of course around the world, other sovereigns picking up the baton. But the market forces are not going to sustain the movement unless we accelerate the pace of innovation and we accelerate the amount of attention being paid to this challenge. In 2035, feels like a fitting place for me to land the math. If we get everything right, heavy industry will be our biggest challenge. We don't get paid to just solve for 2035. We get paid to solve for the whole problem. So our ability to actually be successful in 2035, even if heavy industry is contributing in the order of 2, 3, 400 million metric tons in 2035 to our target, we've got to mature the solutions so that that industry too is on an escape velocity to decarbonize. So that's how we get there. We have proof points, we have progress, and in some cases, we just have a feeling and some momentum. There's the play that you put together on the board with your coach during a timeout, and then you go and you execute it. And on climate, there is a lot that we can do in that way, and we should absolutely do it. But there's a play that requires us just all running and trying to find who's open. And in sectors like heavy industry, that's exactly what we're going to have to do. Keep running hard, trying to find the open person and putting points on the board. Let me close with this. I've talked about looking at every sector. I've talked about going to every corner of the country, making sure every layer of the capital stack is engaged, making sure that we are being inclusive of resilience and adaptation as part of the conversation, because it is so critical, not only to lives and livelihoods, but also to the political economy of climate action. If we cannot get our act together on securing our communities with the damage that we've already unleashed, then they're going to be pretty distrustful of a government that's selling them solutions decades from now. But let me go to really the core of the paradigm shift in the Biden-Harris administration. That is the playbook that gives me a sense that we will go the distance. And that's this. We took a problem that was decades in the making and global in its nature, and we articulated solutions almost exclusively in terms that brought the benefits close, proximate in geography and proximate in time. This has been an enterprise that's almost exclusively focused on the work of economic revival, on places like Dalton, Georgia, where they used to make carpets and the jobs went away, and now they're making solar panels. Places like Weirton, West Virginia, where they used to forge steel and the plant shuttered, and now they're making batteries to supply around the world. That is the way we've articulated. We've articulated climate action that helps kids on the fence line of a port community literally breathe easier. That is where we get the political license to go big, to go fast, and to go the distance. And since this is my literally I'm going to just riff for a second in gratitude. The first is, Jim noted, I was the second National Climate Advisor. The first is someone who found home at Harvard and is from Massachusetts and deserves the gratitude of our nation, but certainly me, Gina McCarthy, who is a public health expert who decided this was the crisis of our times. The second note of gratitude goes to my teammates in the Climate Policy Office. We built a climate headquarters in the West Wing for the first time, but more importantly, we staffed it with experts in every sector of the economy who decided they were up to the task of building an ambitious agenda focused on jobs and justice and delivering local and delivering now. And last, I just have this note of, people have asked me a lot how I feel about leaving. Because, you know, I was not hopeful that we would be handing off to a team that did not want to prioritize this work, at least at banner level. As much as I believe as much as I am rooting for the success of our successors, I was hopeful that we'd be handing off in a way that folks would be excited about articulating greater ambition. And yet I leave feeling so proud, so grateful, so joyful. And it reminds me of a sermon that's been on my mind since I was sitting in the pews at Jimmy Carter's funeral. And it's my favorite sermon from Dr. King. I'll leave you with that. It's the one about unfinished dreams. And he talks in that sermon about the great agony, one of the great agonies of life is to work on these tasks that we know will be unfinished. And he talks about Schubert's symphony, unfinished, and he talks about temples started but never completed. And I take away from that both a sense of I'm working on the right stuff, but also, and that it's okay that it's not done, but also that there's an opportunity here to aspire to something sacred and beautiful, right? We're building a temple that will not be finished. One where the world is free of all of the anguish that we bear witness to every day. But it's not just a task in accounting, it's a task to lift our spirits. And at a very personal level, for me, it's the chance to put more rungs in the ladder into the American dream that my family was able to move up in just one generation. So thank you so much, and I'm excited for the conversation.
Okay, thanks very much, Ali. That was tremendous that you shared those thoughts with us. Let me just go over the format. We're going to spend probably 15 minutes or so in a moderated conversation, which will be led by Erin Douglas. Erin is a reporter on climate for the Boston Globe, where she covers climate adaptation, coasts, disaster response and recovery, and nature-based solutions. She previously reported on energy and climate issues in Texas at the Texas Tribune and the Houston Chronicle. And then after about 15 minutes, Erin will open it up to the floor and we'll have some audience discussion. I do want to make sure we'll end at 1:30 sharp because that's what the advertisement was. So we want to make sure that we actually give the audience a chance to ask their questions. I suspect they will have some.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, thanks so much for being here. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Is my mic on? Okay, awesome. So, as you mentioned, you're about to leave. What comes next for you? Sorry to put you on the spot, but it's a burning question, I think, in all of our minds.
Look, I've been pretty flat out for the last 5 years, from New York into the campaign, into the administration, so I think I'm ready to take a break. But as I noted, there's something far deeper than the paycheck. It's the moral calling to do this work. So I'm sure I will find my way back into the laying of the bricks.
Sure, sure. You spoke a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and the many pieces of legislation that the Biden administration was working on with regards to climate. From your perspective, and I'd also be interested in both of your thoughts, what pieces of policy do you find to be the stickiest that you think will stick around for the long term? And which pieces of policy are you most worried about in terms of vulnerabilities to the Trump administration? If you could just quickly give a couple examples.
The areas I'm most worried about are where the focus is almost exclusively on disadvantaged communities. And I don't say this in some cynical or partisan way. I led the environmental negotiations around the debt ceiling process, and that was the first sort of live fire exercise on trying to roll back the Inflation Reduction Act, which, by the way, House Republicans tried to do 50 times, didn't get done. So I think that tells us something about the durability of the overall exercise. But the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, provisions that lifted up energy communities, folks in Appalachia, those were the most prominent on the chopping block. And I kind of get it. Those people have the least resources to hire lobbyists in Washington to bang down doors. And so I think that is the most vulnerable, and yet it is so essential to this work of sustaining political economy and having moral integrity to this work. On the durable side, look, I think what you find is way more is durable than is appreciated because of the interconnectedness of our economy. So let's take offshore wind, for example. You might not like offshore wind, hypothetically, but if you don't, but you like shipbuilding, you got a big problem because there are a dozen and a half ships being commissioned and built in the Gulf Coast, and you got big sectors of the House of Representatives who've gone and cut ribbons and celebrated the commissioning of these vessels. If these offshore wind farms don't continue to scale up, not just the ones that are already built, but the ones that need to be built, what's going to happen to the shipbuilding industry? That's a big problem. You might not like sustainable aviation fuels, but if you care about the ag sector, you now have deep interconnectivity between the two, and so you gotta. So I think that's the complexity folks will find. I liken it to the current speaker has said, plans to use a scalpel. The problem is if you're operating the scalpel with a blindfold, because sometimes we cannot see the interconnectedness. You're willy-nilly pulling bricks out of a Jenga tower, the whole thing could fall apart, and you didn't even think that's what you were going after. And I think folks will realize that because there's a lot of interconnectivity in these supply chains. They are very dense, and they're hard to fully pick apart.
I'll just say a couple of things so that, just to augment, not to repeat. I think one of the areas where there's likely to be ongoing bipartisan support is in the context of grid modernization, grid build-out. You don't have to be saying low carbon. You can simply say AI and China and grid security and resilience, and they bring you largely to the same place, which is increasing grid reconductoring and all of those sorts of things. I guess one set of worries is around, worries is maybe not the right word, but one set where we could potentially be seeing changes is in the EV tax credit space. So that's clearly listed, at least in the talking points, very high on the list. Whether that actually would be really consequential, we might have different views on that. And in some of the weedier areas, like in charging stations, you might have room for some bipartisan agreement. So I think one of the interesting things going forward, and I hope Ali is able to say some things about this, is thinking about the room for a bipartisan agreement going forward.
Yeah, I am curious about that because local leaders here in New England are thinking a lot right now about how to handle the change in administration and whether to be antagonistic against the Trump administration or to work with the Trump administration when it comes to climate. And I'm curious about both of your thoughts on what areas do you think there might be some common ground for states like Massachusetts and leaders here in Boston to work with the Trump administration?
Yeah, look, I think there's room for policy disagreement, maybe even social disagreement, but we got to root for the success of the United States, and that requires coming to the table in good faith and trying to help the administration be successful in building out the economy for greater prosperity. In the ag sector, there's a farm bill, I noted, it's overdue. The next administration has to reauthorize the farm bill programs. That's an opportunity for people to come together, and it impacts Democratic, Republican districts. And as I noted, the Trump administration, passed a bunch of this stuff in pilot scale. Now we got to help more people tap into it. The industry space, you got senators like Cassidy working with senators like Coons. You got Kramer working with White House on carbon management, on embodied carbon. Are we going to see the most muscular version of that? I don't know. But I think all steps forward are good. So we should seek out the common ground there. And then, to draw on what Professor Stock laid out in the electricity sector, I think there are technologies also where there's surprising coming together. I went down to Vogtle to celebrate the new nuclear plant, and there was a clamoring, Democrats and Republicans, to jump on stage and give remarks for how excited they were. Because that's 1 million skilled hours of work, and it's 1 million homes worth of electricity that's getting delivered, and no one's in a position to turn away good, clean electricity and energy jobs. And so I think there's plenty of opportunity to come together, and I think we will.
A fascinating area. Since you've brought up SAFs and 45Z several times, I can't help but weighing in because I'm sure you recall we spent a lot of time on biofuels. I think this is a fascinating area which could either really work out or could actually really be a disaster. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done, and it's all below the radar type work. And I mean, there's the possibility, there's some really interesting technologies that are allowing things, for example, to go from ethanol to jet fuel, which is one of the big ones that's being developed. That's actually the reason that is working out. The reason we have those plants is because of existing either state tax credits and then also the aviation component of the 45Z tax credit. So there's a path whereby that actually could really promote a transition from on-road use of biofuels to SAFs. But there's also a path where that could really just go south and the entire SAF industry could collapse and we would just go back to having those fuels be on road. So I think that's an area where it's really important to be doing some work both across the aisle but also at the interested states with the federal government.
Yeah. Ali, we spoke in Texas 2 years ago, and at the time, at the Texas Tribune Festival, shout out to that, at the time I asked you how Biden's climate agenda could be implemented in red states, where governors and state agencies were sort of refusing to cooperate with some of the provisions of the IRA and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. And you made an economic argument, which is also, partially what you're making today, that the economics would be so attractive that red states would want to partake in that story. And so first I want to ask, do you think that turned out to be true? And secondly, what do you make of the incoming administration's promises to revoke things like the EV tax credits and to block climate spending? Why aren't those same economics apparently attractive to President-elect Trump?
Yeah. One, I think we've been successful in the main in terms of driving implementation progress. We passed a bill on a partisan line vote, but now you've got more projects in red districts than blue ones. I've sat in panels like this with Governor Stitt from Oklahoma, Governor Holcomb from Indiana, been in celebrations with Republican governors and members from around the country who, it's very hard to, although some do it, to dump on the policy that's turning the lights back on a factory that for decades had fencing around it and was shuttered. So I think there's an element to that. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There are places where we have a long ways to go, and a big part of that is recognizing the connective tissue between what we seek to manufacture and the necessary stability that is provided through homegrown demand for those products. George Bush is the one who initially stoked the biofuel revolution. He didn't just do it by saying, let's build a few biofuels facilities. He did it by creating a market that's transformed into 10% of MoGas and growing. That's a wisdom that I think was more bipartisan before, that will probably need to be more shared going forward if we're going to succeed in the go forward. On the rhetorical disconnect or the Washington Main Street disconnect, I've fortunately been protected by the Hatch Act, which means I have not waded very much into politics, and for the next at least 3 days, we'll definitely not be doing that.
Anything you wanted to add on that? Okay. I didn't want to have a climate conversation today without at least touching on the devastation that is happening in California from the wildfires. And something that has struck me about this climate disaster and also the climate disaster with Hurricane Helene is the amount of disinformation and misinformation that is confusing the public and spreading. And so how does disinformation during a climate disaster like this affect our ability to make progress on climate change and to communicate the urgency with the public?
I have a very incomplete sort of beginnings of an answer, if I have a concept of an answer, if I may. I think the challenge here, the most obvious challenge at this moment to me, is when the disinformation flies, it undermines the very entities, the institutions we're asking people to trust and that are the carriers of the facts. And so, and that's perhaps the most accelerated during these events, which is the time when people are most tuned in. So, the antidote to that, I think, is getting more aggressive and more effective about connecting the American people with the information that these institutions have in a pre-disaster context. We're gonna, I don't know how we do this, that's the incomplete part, but we're going to have to get to someone's doorstep before the hurricane does and help them understand flood risk and so on. And there's some good behavioral work going on around this, including, for example, if you look in Florida, they did some of this work. Republican leadership passed mandatory premium reduction if you bolt and brace your roof. They built a whole market around bolt and brace. So there are models for this, and I think, this is my inkling, that the model for getting the information out has to also carry a low friction way to do something about it in the pre-disaster context. So showing up at someone's door and saying, you now live in an extreme heat vulnerable area, here is a low friction way to do something about it. Or you live in a flood vulnerable area, here's something you can do about it. That coming together in a pre-disaster context, there's no like shortcut way to do it. Because I don't think I'd love to think our regulatory apparatus will catch up quickly enough. I don't think I'm not trying to bet against regulators, but I don't think it will. I think it's going to require just hard work, door-to-door, shoe leather.
I have a million things I could say, but actually I think we should let the audience have some questions.
Excited. So 1 second. I would just like to say, when you ask a question, share your name before you ask, and try to keep your question under 30 seconds. no monologues today. I would love to hear a personal life story at a later time, but maybe we'll just move through quickly. So raise your hand, and I will. I'll do you in the back here, red sweater.
Thank you, Ali, for a very inspiring speech. My name is Leshe. I'm a professor of electrical engineering here at Harvard, working on the electric grid. We are in this Harvard environment, and you were a student here a few years ago.
Yeah.
So Harvard is also actively thinking about sort of curriculums that we prepare for the students of the future on climate, sustainability, and energy. So drawing upon your vast experience out there, and you think about the younger generation of Alis who come to Harvard, what would you wish Harvard to do better to prepare the students in terms of education, research, and public service in this journey?
The first thing that comes to mind is when I was an undergrad, a college Republican, surprise. One of the things I actually did was helped spearhead this thing called Greener Harvard. And at the time, our ambition was getting the flushes that go both directions and double-sided printing. So that's my long way of saying I actually think Harvard students are doing a lot better than they were a couple of decades ago in terms of thinking bigger, systemic, and going deeper at the decarbonization journey. You know, my sense, and I'm sure there are folks who will have very different views on this, we tried to build at the Climate Policy Office people who had engineering degrees, law degrees, basic science, public policy, really all disciplines. And if I parked all of the degrees in one room and then just stared at the output of our team, you wouldn't be able to tell who was more or less successful based on their discipline. The thing that I think is the most necessary is the stuff organizations like Harvard do very well, which is to cultivate a broad and flexible, data-attentive, human-centered discipline about thinking about the problems that face our society, that allow people to go from, you know, the macro consideration, understand there is a micro element to it, understanding both matters, that allow them to go from the stylized solution and fluidly move to the real world. And ultimately, I think in whatever domain they operate, have thought enough about, I think it's about thinking about it yourself, thought enough about what working in this space means to them that they can inspire other people. If you're just kind of here without having that basis of self-reflection, it's hard to pull other people along. But there's no, I don't think there's, it's hard to say there's a bottled curriculum. I do think you got to kind of know, you know, here are the sectors, here's what's going up, here's what might bring it down, here are some of the core technologies. But beyond that, I think it's that all disciplines welcome.
Thanks, Ali. It's great to see you again. I'm Henk Ovink, currently Executive Director of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. We work together on President Obama's Hurricane Sandy task force. I have a question on your first point you mentioned on vulnerability, which was really focused on the natural environment. You never came back to that in what you are most afraid of. What's the economics for our natural resources so critical, not only for resiliency, but also for mitigation and the energy transition in the context of a new administration? And how does that match the most vulnerable communities, as well as the more affluent communities that have a disconnect to those natural resources? Where do you see that future?
You know, and Jim may have interesting commentary on this. One of the exercises we launched in this administration early on is to try to bring more discipline to the effort to monetize and map the economic value of natural resources. It was an effort Jim's successor colleagues at CEA, our Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at the OMB, others have drawn I think it's just with candor, that corpus of work, as well as what undergirds a lot of the work in voluntary carbon markets, remains maybe more, there's been a lot of maturation, but remains still the subject of enough skepticism that it's had a hard time getting robustly integrated into government decision making. I think I'm not super optimistic about the next few years being the moment where someone decides to take a lot of risk on that on the public side. So the question then becomes, can the private actors put some proof points out there that give further credibility and traction behind this exercise? But I'm not, we tried, we're gonna keep trying, we all should keep trying. I'm not like super bullish on where we are today.
Take one, maybe two more. This one.
Yes. Hi, I'm Mary Rice. I'm a lung doctor, and I'm the director for the Center for Climate Health and the Global Environment at the
Amazing.
Chan School. And one thing that we both have in common is we were preceded by Gina McCarthy, also greatly admired. And one of your points was that a lesson learned from the IRA is framing things in terms of immediate benefits. And you mentioned jobs, and you also mentioned the kid on the fence line who was breathing easier. And I was hoping you could share some stories where health benefits were a motivator for climate action and your thoughts on opportunities going forward.
Yeah, the bipartisan infrastructure law, not the Inflation Reduction Act, included funding for what is now translated into thousands of school districts across the country, allowing a kid to get from point A to point B without having to jump on a bus that pumps diesel pollution into the sky. That was progress built on bipartisan legislation that's been authorized by multiple Congresses, the DERA program. And what gives me a lot of optimism about the salience of this is that the same group of members in the House and the Senate who were skeptical about parts of the EV transition, when you help them visualize the diesel school bus and then the progress we've made to get off of that, and then the gains we could make to go all the way to zero tailpipe emissions came around. So what's exciting is now in Georgia, Bluebird, with now a newly unionized factory, is manufacturing those. So we've got the capacity to source the solutions, but there's incredible resonance around that. I think the challenge on this is we did an analysis when we passed the IRA of, I don't even know how much it was, like 900,000 asthma attacks avoided by the IRA. That doesn't land. That's abstract, it's far away, and it goes to my point about the benefits are not proximate from a geographic and temporal perspective. It's really hard to harness the political economy from what you're putting out.
One more, really quick. Okay.
Hello, I'm Rob Werner. I'm the State Director for the League of Conservation Voters in New Hampshire and very involved with offshore wind. Quick question in terms of your perspective around Gulf of Maine. The lease areas and contracts have been fully committed now for those 4 of the 8 lease areas. So going forward, we've got a situation that becomes very practical, and then in the larger sense, it's an investment of the private sector. So how does all this private sector investment that have occurred over the last number of years maintain our momentum?
Yeah. So big fan of contract law and common law courts. So feeling really good about that. The other thing I'm a big fan of is building a machine that is really hard to turn off. So you've got almost in 50 states now an offshore wind supply chain. You got the folks in South Carolina and Nexans building the cabling that only offshore wind will use. How do you make the decision and then sustain it to turn off those factories? And part of, I think, the brilliance of the Made in America strategy is it set off a race to the top around the world to do the same thing, but it also comes with it is this incredible political durability and political insurance policy when you try to turn off. And this goes, Jim was talking about the EV tax credit. There's the EV tax credit, there's the residential tax credit, there's a bunch of retail stuff, and there's a bunch of demand side stuff, and others. I think folks who want to walk away from that will find very quickly that that is very hard to do, because you got now an entire supply chain that is threatened if that demand gets destabilized. So we may hit a roadblock, but I think we'll get to the other side.
Well, thanks so much for your time. Thank you all for wonderful questions.